Last week, I was serving at the 9:30 a.m. Sunday morning Mass with Father Glenn. And he was wondering whether or not I was paying attention to his homily or falling asleep. But the sign that I actually was awake was that I remembered this story he told of taking a cab with some friends of his to a play in New York City. And the cab driver was a female Muslim. And each time she arrived at a red light, a guy with a squeegee would come by and clean her windshield, whether it needed it or not. And at each light, she would pull a dollar bill from her visor and give it to this guy. And Father Glenn at one point says to her, "Why are you paying these guys each time?" And she replied, "My religion teaches me to care for the poor." You see, I was paying attention. You see, her Muslim faith taught her to care for the poor, not to ignore it. Caring for the poor was so much a part of her faith that she actually saw the poor and cared for them and just took this for granted as what you were supposed to do. And as I was listening to this story, I started to wonder if there was a large survey done of Catholics, and we were asked whether or not Christ teaches us to care for the poor, I wonder what people would say. If we were asked whether or not caring for the poor is central to our faith, I wonder what people would say. Certainly our faith teaches us to come to Mass on Sunday or Saturday night. Our faith teaches us to receive the Eucharist, to make the sign of the cross. We are known, as Catholics, we are known to be pro-life. But are we known to be pro-poor? Are we known to have a preference for the poor? Because we have Moses, we have the prophets. We believe the guy has been raised from the dead and has come to us. But do we know that seeing and caring for the poor is fundamental to our faith? You see, part of the problem that we all suffer from, at least in this country, is that we live in a culture that is profoundly shaped by neoliberal economics. And in a neoliberal economy, the free market is the will that should be done. The market is the source of our salvation. The wealthy and the famous are the new saints. And the free market teaches us that the poor are lazy. They don't want to work hard. They don't deserve help. And those immigrants, they're really dangerous. They're going to destroy our country. And some Catholics are more formed by this approach than the gospel. Years ago, I once preached a homily about a guy named David I got to know who would stand down on the corner of Powder Mill and New Hampshire and ask for money. And after Mass, a parishioner I really respected came up to me and he said to me, "You know, those people, they just don't want to work. They really like begging." And I'm thinking, like, that guy's out there like 10 hours a day, rain or shine. I've had other parishioners tell me that I'm completely against helping immigrants. They'll destroy our country. And it makes me wonder, to what extent have we heard Jesus' call to love our neighbor, to respond to the cry of the poor? Now, you may be surprised how often Jesus teaches us to listen to the cry of the poor and act on their behalf. In preparation for this homily, I started from the beginning of Luke's Gospel and went right through. And I was amazed at how often he was calling us to care for the poor, acting on behalf of the poor. So I just want to share with you some of what Jesus says and does so that you really see that this is central to our Catholic faith. Now, Luke's Gospel begins with Jesus going into the synagogue in Nazareth. Do you remember this? he opens up the scroll of Isaiah and he says the following: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." And Jesus brought good news to the poor by healing the sick and the blind and lame, by allowing the leper to touch him and get healed, by feeding the hungry. And then remember, Jesus taught, "Blessed are the poor, for the kingdom of God is yours." It's Matthew who says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," but in Luke, it's "Blessed are the poor." Now, why are they blessed? They're not blessed because they're poor. There's no blessing in that. That's a very harsh existence. They're blessed because Jesus believes the kingdom of God is coming, that God's regime, God's reign is arriving, and this is good news for the poor because hard hearts are being changed. They're being traded for hearts of compassion and mercy. It's good news because Jesus is coming and feeding the poor and calling others to join him in that practice. He believed, you see, that a new age was dawning, an age where people actually heard the cry of the poor, saw the poor, were not blind to the poor at their gate like the rich man was in today's parable. We're not indifferent to the poor like the rich man in today's parable. And you may remember, a couple of weeks ago, we heard Jesus challenge his wealthy host. Don't invite your wealthy friends and neighbors and family. No, he said, send out invitations to the poor, the blind, the lame, the lepers, the people that can't repay you. He just flipped the tables on that whole way of living. You know, in the ancient Roman world, there were no food pantries for the poor. There were no hospitals. There were no services for the orphan and widow. It was Christians who knew Jesus' teaching to care for the poor, who established food pantries, who offered places for the poor and the widow, the orphan to come to. It was Christians who invented hospitals. We invented hospitals. We visited the sick and cared for the poor. There was a famine in the 4th century in Rome. A plague in the 4th century in Rome. And the Christians were attending to their sick. The pagan doctors fled. And the pagans are watching the Christians. They're stunned that their doctors stayed and served and healed the sick. And then they were really stunned when these Christian doctors went and started to care for the pagan sick, because they heard Jesus call to care for the poor and the sick. So my friends, in today's parable, we are reminded that we have Moses, the teachings of Moses, the teaching of the prophets, that Jesus has been raised from the dead and a new age has dawned. And what he's trying to do in this parable is to kind of jolt us out of our sleep, awaken us to see the poor at the gate of our home, to see the poor in our cities, to hear their cry and to act on their behalf. And when this happens, we will be cooperating with the arrival of the kingdom of God. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? When did we see you a stranger and make you feel welcome? When did we see you lacking clothing and clothe you? When did we visit you in prison? This is Jesus calling us to act on his behalf for the poor. So perhaps one day, maybe you're driving your Uber to try and make a little extra money, and somebody will ask you why you help the poor. And maybe you will reply, because my faith teaches me to do so. Because King Jesus asks us to do so. He taught me, you will say, to hear the cry of the poor and act on their behalf.